stopped writhing and fighting back, they believed he was dead. But far from it, Gray was not going to make it easy for them. When he lay there still, they relaxed their grip. And he was up grabbing a cudgel and walloping them with it. With his face covered in blood, weakened from the back wound, he began fighting his way to his fishing boat. Once again, they leapt on him, and one, carrying a gutting knife, slit his wrist, getting sprayed by his blood in the process. With every beat of his heart, his blood gushed from him as he reached the boat. He jumped on and managed to hold the others at bay whilst he set off out into the North Sea. How I wish I could give you a happy ending. Instead, you get one of the earliest cover-ups. Later that day, Edwards, sent by the church, arrived from Alnwick and demanded to see Gray immediately. A church official explained that Gray was out fishing and he wouldn't be back till late that evening. He never returned. The boat was never found, and Marianne waited for 3 months in Alnwick and never saw nor heard from her fiancé again. Most believe he succumbed to his wounds whilst at sea, and the following day there was a storm and parts of a boat were washed up just south of Berwick, but no body ever recovered. Anderson arrived to claim his boats and house and was refused. He was told the boats were both lost at sea, and the church now owned his house and Marianne's cottage. 5 months later, the church sold a fishing boat that they denied to Andrew Hughes of Berwick. His family still have it. Marianne travelled down to Tyneside and is believed to have set up home in Gateshead, the very first Jewish person to settle in Bensham, where there is now the biggest Jewish community outside of Israel. Now, the Devil's Mark has also made itself a home in the centre of Newcastle, where there are so many back alleys and quiet little side streets that most people never walk down, and such is the case around Newcastle's cathedral, where the small lane called Amen Corner leads to the remnants of an old plague cemetery. Some of the gravestones have a skull and crossbones to illustrate how they died. Yet all these years on, many claim the bodies to be those of pirates. Not so. In years gone by, the tiny overpopulated city with its riverside districts teeming with families trying to get near where the work was on the bustling River Tyne. At that time, the entire city drank water from open cisterns in the marketplace, where the Centre for Life now stands, along with the others at the New Gate and at Cale Cross. You must also remember that at the time, the way to get rid of rubbish, urine and feces was to hurl it out of the window. It didn't take long before the water was contaminated with all kinds of aggressive bacteria. The Tyne, the other source of water, was already filthy. There were a few burns running across the city: the Lort burn, Denton burn, Seaton burn, all loaded with an array of bugs that, depending on your immune system, would give you diarrhea, smallpox, scarlet fever, typhus, diphtheria, measles, and in each case, possibly leading to death. So let's go back to 1590. Close to 2,000 people had already died of the plague, aided and abetted by the unhygienic water supply. So imagine if your ship pulls into port at Newcastle, docking where the base of the Tyne Bridge now stands. The first thing those sailors wanted was to get to the prostitutes that flocked down to earn a living from their guests. The captain ordered the entire crew not to disembark. Instead, local labour, wearing masks, carried off the merchandise, storing it at the quayside warehouses. The Dutch vessel would set off the following morning without taking on food or water. However, the longing for sex was too much for Paul van Houten, an officer on board, who slipped off the craft after dark. He began drinking at once and dallying with the ladies of the night. He was back on the quay at 6 a.m. when the ship was due to leave, yet it had already gone. The captain, realising what he'd done, was not prepared to risk his crew in a plague city. Van Houten now had to find another way to get back to Holland. But he developed this unpleasant cough. Within days, bubonic sores had developed under his arms and around his groin. The Devil's Mark had changed. His money ran out quickly and he had nowhere to sleep, so he began sleeping in the woods that used to stand up the stairs alongside the cooperage. A huge plague pit was dug in the place where a tiny cemetery now stands, next to Newcastle Cathedral, and Van Houten, masked so that people could not see that he was infected, would earn a little money piling the dead bodies into the pit. His trail briefly disappeared, for it's thought that rather than suffer the final horrific stages of the plague, open, stinking wounds, decaying flesh, and having seen plague sufferers beaten to death by the healthy, it's thought that he took his own life by slitting his wrists. Yet Thomas Hepburn, another labourer who worked beside Van Houten, claims that he saw the man the following week wading around in the pit and climbing out. He said that his hands were soaked in blood and his face was distorted with plague sores, oozing pus. And around this time, many plague sufferers were hurled into pits. Some tried to survive by drinking blood and eating the still warm bodies. Some tales say that before covering over the pit and pouring on oil and pitch to burn it, they had to hit Van Houten with a shovel to stop him disturbing the pyre. But whatever happened, the fire was lit and the bodies cleansed of the plague. There was no way we could have conquered the plague, yet the wonder of nature did it when brown country rats moved into the city, killing and eating all of the plague-carrying rats. Over the years, right up to today, the crumbling body of Van Houten is known to appear around the back of Newcastle Cathedral. People who work nearby see him regularly, sometimes as a sad-looking grey figure, yet more often sweeping along an area where the cars are allowed to park. There were over 100 sightings in the late 1800s, and he's still spotted regularly. Council worker George Pearson from West Denton told a local newspaper in 1964, "He's a tatty bloke and his face looks as if it's rotting. It's obvious the man's dead. I've no idea if he's a ghost or a zombie because I've never seen either of them before. All I know is that my entire crew of 8 lads saw him disappear right in front of us." Julie Duffy from Baker walked through the ghost in the 1970s. She called night owls saying, "I saw a ghost round the back of the cathedral. Its cheeks were wide open and you could see his skull underneath. I panicked and I ran towards the lane out and found myself running right through him. He stank feisty and I wanted to be sick because it stayed in my lungs, and I looked back and he was still there and I wanted to scream but I couldn't because my throat was paralysed." Tony Gill from Gateshead was sitting having a sandwich during his lunch hour on a bench near the cathedral when he smelled something awful. And there, walking towards him, was what he thought was a tramp. Yet his fingers looked skeletal and there were no eyes in his sockets. The figure moved up beside him and he was petrified. He stared directly into his face for what seemed like minutes. And the figure just disappeared. In 2004, a group of girls, Sue Richardson, Claire Horswell, Jean Dunn and Marie Watson, were cutting through the station towards Dean Street for a hen night. When behind the cathedral they saw a man crouched over a grave. They thought he was ill, so walked up to him. Sue took up the story. "We thought he'd collapsed, but when I got up to him, he looked sort of see-through.